There is a collection of jewels sitting inside a vault at the Bank of Italy right now. Around 2,000 pearls, nearly 7,000 diamonds, totaling 2,000 carats, sapphires, emeralds, rubies, all mounted on necklaces and tiaras and brooches, and none of it has seen the light of day in 80 years. The vault has only been opened once since 1946. The family that once wore these jewels, the family that once ruled all of Italy, the family that unified an entire peninsula and then watched it slip through their fingers. That family is still fighting over who gets to claim them. This is the story of what happened to Italy's royal family after the monarchy fell, and it is a story of exile, scandal, betrayal, murder charges, secret societies, reality television, and a feud between cousins over a throne that no longer exists. Now, to understand the fall, you first need to understand the rise. Because this family didn't just stumble into royalty. They built it, brick by brick, war by war, marriage by marriage, across nearly 1,000 years. The House of Savoy is one of the oldest dynasties in all of Europe. Their origins trace back to a man named Humbert the White-Handed, a feudal lord who held the county of Savoy in the Western Alps sometime around the year 1000. For centuries, his descendants expanded their territory through strategic marriages, military campaigns, and a remarkable ability to pick the right side of European conflicts. By the 1700s, they'd upgraded from dukes to kings, first holding the crown of Sicily, and then exchanging it for the crown of Sardinia. They ruled from Turin in the northwestern corner of the Italian peninsula, governing a relatively small kingdom called Piedmont Sardinia. But here is what made the House of Savoy different from every other minor European dynasty. While other royal houses were content to hold their corners of the map, the Savoys had ambition on a scale that bordered on recklessness. And in the 1800s, that ambition collided with a powerful idea sweeping across Europe, the idea of nationalism. The idea that the Italian-speaking peoples scattered across dozens of kingdoms and duchies and papal states should be one nation. The movement was called the Risorgimento, which translates roughly to renewal or resurgence, and the Savoys positioned themselves at the very center of it. Under King Victor Emmanuel II, and with the diplomatic brilliance of his prime minister, Count Camillo Benso di Cavour, Piedmont Sardinia became the engine driving Italian unification. Cavour engineered alliances with France, manipulated Austria into war, and cleared the path for military conquest. Meanwhile, in the south, the legendary revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi was conquering Sicily and Naples, with a volunteer army of about 1,000 men. In 1860, at a now-famous meeting at Teano, Garibaldi handed his conquests over to Victor Emmanuel II, and in 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed. Victor Emmanuel II became the first king of Italy, and the House of Savoy went from ruling a mid-size Alpine kingdom to governing an entire peninsula of 22 million people. He was hailed as the father of the fatherland. When he died in 1878, Italy mourned him as a national hero. His monument, the massive Altare della Patria in Rome, still dominates the city's skyline today. But the seeds of the family's downfall were already being planted in the generations that followed. Because the Savoys had created Italy, yes, but governing Italy turned out to be a very different challenge. The South resented northern domination, poverty was rampant, millions of Italians emigrated, and the parliamentary system that evolved under the monarchy grew increasingly unstable. Victor Emmanuel II was succeeded by his son Umberto, who reigned until the year 1900. Umberto was assassinated by an anarchist in Monza, shot 3 times while sitting in an open carriage after an athletic event. His death was a grim omen. Italy was a nation in turmoil, and the crown was becoming a target. And then came Victor Emmanuel III. He was the man who would ultimately destroy everything his family had built. Born in 1869 in Naples, he was the only son of Umberto I. He was short, painfully shy, and deeply insecure about his physical stature. He stood just over 5 feet tall, and contemporary accounts describe him as reserved to the point of appearing cold. He had none of the charisma or military swagger that had defined his grandfather. But he was intelligent, well-read in history and numismatics, and he possessed a quiet stubbornness that would prove catastrophic. Victor Emmanuel III became king in 1900, inheriting a country that was fracturing along political lines. Italy fought in the First World War on the side of the Allies, and while the country emerged on the winning side, the victory felt hollow. Italy had been promised territorial gains by Britain and France, territories along the Adriatic and in Africa, but at the Paris Peace Conference, many of those promises were broken. Italians called it the mutilated victory, and the resentment it generated poisoned Italian politics for a generation. Returning soldiers found no jobs. Inflation was devastating. Strikes paralyzed industry. Socialist and communist movements were gaining ground, and into this chaos stepped a former socialist journalist turned ultra-nationalist agitator named Benito Mussolini. Mussolini founded the fascist movement in 1919, building a paramilitary force of black-shirted followers who attacked socialists, broke up strikes, and used systematic violence to seize control of local governments across northern Italy. By 1922, Mussolini felt strong enough to make his move. He organized the March on Rome, a mass mobilization of his blackshirts converging on the capital. It was part political theater, part genuine threat. The Italian army could have stopped them easily. The Prime Minister at the time begged Victor Emmanuel to declare martial law and order the army to disperse the marchers. But the king refused. Whether out of fear, political calculation, or sheer indecision, Victor Emmanuel III instead invited Mussolini to Rome and asked him to form a government. On October 29, 1922, Benito Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy, and the king had just handed the country to a dictator. Now what followed was a slow strangulation of Italian democracy, and the king was complicit every step of the way. In 1925, he signed a law dissolving every political party except Mussolini's. He stood by as press freedoms were abolished, as political opponents were imprisoned and murdered, as Italy transformed from a constitutional monarchy into a fascist dictatorship. The king retained his title, his palaces, his formal powers. Mussolini still technically needed the king's signature on laws and decrees. Italy became what historians have called a diarchy, a state with two centers of power, but in practice Mussolini held the real authority. The king was a rubber stamp, a convenient symbol of legitimacy that the dictator kept around because it suited him. And Victor Emmanuel did not just passively watch. In 1935, he gave his approval to the invasion of Ethiopia, a brutal colonial war that involved the use of chemical weapons against civilians. In 1938, he signed the racial laws, legislation modeled on Nazi Germany's Nuremberg laws, that stripped Italian Jews of their civil rights, banned them from public employment, forbade intermarriage, and set in motion a persecution that would eventually lead thousands of Italian Jews to concentration camps and death. And in 1940, the king formally signed Italy's declaration of war against Britain and France, dragging Italy into the Second World War alongside Adolf Hitler. The war was a disaster. Italian forces suffered devastating defeats in North Africa, in Greece, in the Mediterranean. The country's infrastructure was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. And by the summer of 1943, with the Allies invading Sicily and bombs falling on Rome for the first time, the facade finally cracked. On July 25, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism voted to restore the king's full constitutional powers. Among those who voted against Mussolini was his own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano. The next day, Victor Emmanuel summoned Mussolini to the royal residence, informed him that he was being replaced by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, and had him arrested as he walked out the door. It was the king's most decisive act in over 2 decades, but it came far too late. In September, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies, and the country plunged into chaos. The king and the government fled Rome, abandoning the capital to the Germans, who quickly occupied northern and central Italy. Mussolini was rescued from captivity by German commandos and installed as the puppet ruler of the so-called Italian Social Republic in the north. Italy was now effectively two countries fighting a civil war against itself, while also being a battlefield for the Allies and the Nazis. The king's flight from Rome was the final humiliation. Whatever residual respect Italians might have had for the monarchy evaporated in that moment. He had enabled fascism. He had signed the racial laws. He had dragged the country into a catastrophic war. Now, he had abandoned his own capital. The Italian resistance, the partisan movement that fought a brutal guerrilla war against the German occupiers and Italian fascists, had no love for the House of Savoy. Neither did the political parties that were rebuilding Italian democracy from the ashes. In June of 1944, under intense pressure from the Allies and Italian politicians, Victor Emmanuel III transferred most of his powers to his son, Crown Prince Umberto, giving him the title of Lieutenant General of the realm. The old king kept his formal title, but was effectively sidelined. The hope was that Umberto, who was untainted by the worst of his father's collaborations, could salvage the monarchy's reputation. And in many ways, Umberto was a different man entirely. Tall, handsome, educated, and far more politically astute than his father, Umberto had earned genuine respect during the war. He had commanded Italian forces in several campaigns and was known for his personal courage. His wife, Marie-José of Belgium, was even more remarkable. During the war, she had actively sympathized with the Italian resistance, secretly smuggling arms and supplies to the partisans, and even financing their operations from exile in Switzerland. She was arguably the most popular member of the royal family, but none of it was enough. The stain of Victor Emmanuel III's collaboration with Mussolini had poisoned the well. On May 9, 1946, Victor Emmanuel finally abdicated in a last-ditch attempt to save the dynasty. Umberto became King Umberto II, but he would hold the crown for only 34 days. Italians gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the May King. On June 2, 1946, Italians went to the polls in the most consequential vote in their country's history. It was also the first time Italian women were allowed to vote, dramatically expanding the electorate. The question was simple: monarchy or republic? The results were close but decisive. Approximately 12.7 million Italians voted for a republic. Roughly 10.7 million voted to keep the monarchy. The republic won by a margin of about 54% to 46%. The geographic divide was striking. The industrialized, politically radical North voted overwhelmingly for the republic. The more conservative, agrarian South, where the monarchy still carried emotional weight, voted to keep the king, but it was not enough. Umberto II did not go quietly. He publicly accused the government of electoral fraud. He refused to accept the results. There were tense days in which some feared a coup or even civil war, but in the end, on June 13, 1946, Umberto boarded a plane and left Italy. He would never return. Now, this is where the story takes a turn that most people do not expect, because the Italian Republic did not simply ask the Savoys to leave. The new constitution ratified in 1948 contained a provision, the 13th Transitional Disposition, that was breathtaking in its severity. All male members and descendants of the House of Savoy were constitutionally banned from entering Italian soil. Not just the king, not just his son, all male heirs forever. Their properties were confiscated, their assets were seized. The crown jewels, that extraordinary collection of diamonds and pearls and sapphires, were locked in a vault at the Bank of Italy. The former kings of Italy were erased from their own country's territory with the stroke of a pen. Victor Emmanuel III, the man who had enabled all of it, went into exile in Egypt. He settled in Alexandria, a broken and isolated figure. He died on December 28, 1947, barely a year and a half after leaving Italy. He was 78 years old. His body remained in Egypt for decades, a king without a country, buried far from the land his family had unified. It was not until 2017 that his remains were finally repatriated to Italy and buried at the sanctuary of Vico Fort in Piedmont, a move that sparked fierce public debate about whether a king who had collaborated with fascism deserved to rest on Italian soil. His wife, Queen Elena of Montenegro, followed him into Egyptian exile. She died in 1952 in Montpellier, France. There has been, interestingly, a movement in recent years to seek her beatification by the Catholic Church, citing her humanitarian work during the First World War and her charitable efforts. But critics have pointed out that she stood beside her husband through every dark chapter, including the racial laws, and that sainthood would be a strange reward for complicity in fascism. Umberto II settled in Cascais on the Portuguese Riviera, a strip of coastline near Lisbon that had become a kind of gathering place for Europe's deposed royalty. He lived there for 37 years, surrounded by the trappings of a court that no longer existed. He maintained his royal protocols, received visitors as though he were still a reigning monarch, and carefully tended the myth that he would one day return to Italy. He never did. He never set foot on Italian soil again for the rest of his life. Umberto died on March 18, 1983 in Geneva, Switzerland, at the age of 78. He was buried at Hautecombe Abbey in France, the ancient burial place of the Savoy dynasty, far from the country he had briefly ruled. But if the story of the older generation is tragic in a somewhat conventional sense, the story of the next generation is something else entirely. Because Umberto's son, Vittorio Emanuele, the man who would have been king, turned out to be one of the most controversial and scandal-plagued figures in modern European royalty. Vittorio Emanuele was born in 1937 in Naples, and he was 9 years old when the family was forced into exile. He grew up in Portugal and Switzerland, a prince without a country, bearing a title that carried weight in aristocratic circles, but no legal meaning anywhere. He worked as a banker, an aircraft salesman, and eventually an arms dealer. He was known for his explosive temper, his lavish lifestyle, and his talent for finding trouble. In 1969, Vittorio Emanuele unilaterally declared himself King of Italy, effectively repudiating his own father, who was still alive. He argued that by agreeing to submit to the referendum, Umberto had technically abdicated. This caused a deep rift within the family and within monarchist circles, many of whom considered the move an act of breathtaking arrogance and disrespect. But the most shocking incident came in 1978, when Vittorio Emanuele was aboard his yacht off the coast of Corsica. He claimed he heard a noise and fired his rifle at what he thought was a burglar. The bullet struck a 19-year-old German tourist named Dirk Hamer, who was sleeping on a neighboring boat. Hamer was critically wounded and died several months later. Vittorio Emanuele was tried for murder in France. He was acquitted of the manslaughter charge, but convicted of a firearms offense and received a 6-month suspended sentence. He was later recorded in a wiretap, admitting that he had been in the wrong and boasting that he had fooled the French judges. The case haunted him for the rest of his life, and it did not stop there. It was later revealed that Vittorio Emanuele had been a member of Propaganda Due, better known as P2, one of the most notorious secret organizations in modern Italian history. P2 was a clandestine Masonic lodge that operated as a shadow government within Italy during the 1970s and early 1980s. Its membership included politicians, military officers, intelligence agents, industrialists, and media figures. The lodge was implicated in a web of corruption, political manipulation, terrorist attacks, and even connections to organized crime. For a man who claimed to represent the dignity of the Italian crown, membership in P2 was a devastating revelation. Then, in 2006, the scandals reached their peak. Following an investigation by prosecutors in Potenza, Vittorio Emanuele was arrested on charges of criminal association, racketeering, conspiracy, corruption, and exploitation of prostitution. The charges were connected to activities at the Campione d'Italia, an Italian enclave in Switzerland. He was imprisoned and later placed under house arrest. Although he was eventually acquitted of all charges between 2007 and 2010, the damage to his reputation was immense. The would-be King of Italy had been led away in handcuffs on charges of running a prostitution ring. Meanwhile, through all of this, the exile ban remained in place. For over 50 years, not a single male member of the House of Savoy was legally permitted to enter Italy. The ban became a subject of growing debate as the decades passed. Some argued it was an archaic remnant of post-war politics, a collective punishment imposed on an entire family for the sins of one king. Others insisted it was a necessary constitutional safeguard, a guarantee that the monarchy could never be restored. In 1999, Vittorio Emmanuele filed a case at the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that his exile violated his fundamental rights. The court agreed to hear the case, and the political pressure on the Italian government began to mount. In February of 2002, Vittorio Emmanuele and his son, Emanuele Filiberto, published a signed letter through their lawyers, formally expressing their loyalty to the Italian Republic and its constitution. It was a public act of submission, a former king's heir pledging allegiance to the republic that had overthrown his family. On October 23, 2002, the Italian parliament voted to repeal the exile provision. After 56 years, the male members of the House of Savoy were finally allowed to return to Italy. The Savoys came back, but the Italy they returned to was a country that had largely moved on without them. Vittorio Emmanuele and Emanuele Filiberto made a high-profile return visit. They had a 20-minute audience with Pope John Paul II at the Vatican, but the reception in the rest of Italy was decidedly mixed. When they visited Naples, hundreds of noisy demonstrators lined the streets chanting against the family, and the protests came from two completely opposite directions. Anti-monarchists protested the return of the Savoys on principle, but supporters of the House of Bourbon Two Sicilies, the royal family that the Savoys had deposed when they unified Italy in 1861, also turned out to protest. In the south, many people still remembered the Savoys not as the unifiers of Italy, but as northern conquerors who had destroyed the kingdom of the Two Sicilies and plundered its wealth. In 2005, Vittorio Emanuele published a letter in the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, issuing an official apology to Italy's Jewish population for the Savoy family's role in signing the racial laws of 1938. It was a significant gesture, but for many it came far too late and from the wrong generation. The man who had actually signed those laws, Victor Emmanuel III, had never expressed remorse. Now, the family also attempted to reclaim some of what they had lost. They demanded $380 million in reparations from the Italian government for the decades of exile, plus the return of all confiscated properties, including, remarkably, the Quirinal Palace, which had served as the official residence of the President of the Italian Republic since 1946. The government's response was blunt. Officials suggested that it should be Italy seeking reparations from the Savoys, not the other way around, given the monarchy's support for fascism and its wartime conduct. The family eventually dropped the compensation claim after a public outcry, but the crown jewels remained a source of contention. When the exile ban was first lifted, Vittorio Emanuele had publicly renounced any claim to the jewels, saying they were no longer the family's property. But in 2021, the family reversed course and demanded the jewels back. When the Bank of Italy refused, the Savoys filed a lawsuit in 2022. The Italian government responded by citing Provision 13 of the Constitution, stating that the jewels were assets of the Crown of Italy and therefore belonged to the state, not to the family personally. The dispute remains unresolved. Those nearly 7,000 diamonds are still sitting in that vault, caught in a legal limbo between a republic that will not give them up and a royal family that insists they were wrongfully taken. And then there is Emanuele Filiberto, the grandson of Italy's last king. Born in 1972 in Geneva, Switzerland, he grew up in exile, never seeing the country his family had once ruled until the ban was lifted when he was 30 years old. He is, in many ways, the most surprising chapter in this entire story, because Emanuele Filiberto did not follow the traditional path of a deposed royal. He did not retreat into quiet aristocratic obscurity. He did not spend his days in a Swiss villa reminiscing about lost glory. Instead, he became a reality television star. In 2009, he appeared on the Italian version of Dancing with the Stars, called Ballando con le Stelle, and he won. The grandson of the last king of Italy, competing in sequined outfits on a Saturday night entertainment show was a spectacle that would have been unimaginable to his ancestors. But it made him enormously popular with a segment of the Italian public that had no memory of the monarchy and found the whole thing charmingly absurd. He also launched a food business in the United States, a fast casual restaurant called the Prince of Venice, named after his royal title. He has appeared on Italian cooking shows, given political commentary on television, and generally positioned himself as a modern, media-savvy figure who understands that in the 21st century, relevance is more important than reverence. But beneath the television appearances and the pasta restaurants, there is a more calculated game being played. Emanuele Filiberto has been actively working to modernize the House of Savoy's internal rules. In 2019, he changed the family's succession laws, which had traditionally followed Salic law, meaning only males could inherit the headship of the house. He decreed that his eldest daughter, Princess Vittoria, born in 2003, would be his successor. It was a radical break with 1,000 years of tradition and infuriated the other branch of the family. Because the House of Savoy is not just divided between monarchists and republicans, it is divided against itself. For decades, there has been a bitter feud between the main branch, descended from Umberto II through Vittorio Emanuele and now Emanuele Filiberto, and the Aosta branch, a cadet line of the family descended from a cousin of the last king. The Aosta branch argues that Vittorio Emanuele's marriage to Marina Ricolfi Doria, a Swiss-Italian water-skiing champion, was contracted without the proper royal consent and was therefore morganatic, meaning it excluded his descendants from the line of succession. If this argument holds, then the headship of the House of Savoy should have passed not to Vittorio Emanuele's line but to the Duke of Aosta. Prince Amadeo, the 5th Duke of Aosta, pressed this claim for decades before his death in 2021. His son, Prince Aimone, the 6th Duke of Aosta, has continued the fight. The two branches have clashed publicly, most memorably at a dinner on the eve of the wedding of Crown Prince Felipe of Spain in 2004, where tensions reportedly boiled over. The Aosta branch has declared Emanuele Filiberto's decree allowing female succession to be totally illegitimate, citing old dynastic bylaws. They even convened what they called a consulta, a royal advisory council, to issue an opinion against it. Though Emanuele Filiberto dismissed this body as a fabrication, pointing out that the original consulta died when his grandfather left Italy. So here we are, the House of Savoy, one of the oldest dynasties in European history, the family that unified Italy, that gave Europe some of its most consequential kings, that shaped the political map of the continent for nearly 1,000 years, is now a family of exiles and television personalities fighting over the headship of a house that rules nothing, suing a republic for jewels locked in a bank vault, and arguing about whether a princess born in the 21st century can inherit a title that has no legal standing in any country on earth. Vittorio Emanuele, the scandal-plagued son of the last king, died on February 3, 2024, in Geneva, at the age of 86. His funeral was held on February 10th at the Cathedral of Turin, attended by representatives of other European royal families, including Queen Sofia of Spain and members of the Belgian and Greek royal houses. He was later buried at the Basilica of Superga in Turin, the historic resting place of the Savoy dynasty, and with his death, the question of succession became even more fraught. Emanuele Filiberto now claims the headship of the house. Aimone, Duke of Aosta, disputes it. And somewhere in the background, Princess Vittoria of Savoy, a young woman in her early 20s, is being positioned as the potential first female head of the House of Savoy in its entire history. In 2025, Emmanuel Filiberto and his wife, the French actress Clotilde Courreau, formally announced their separation after having been apart since 2021. The personal life of the prince mirrors the fragmentation of his dynasty. A family that once governed 22 million people cannot seem to govern itself. And yet, the legacy of the House of Savoy is everywhere in Italy, even if most Italians do not think about it consciously. The Quirinal Palace, where the President of the Italian Republic lives and works, was built as a royal residence. The massive monument to Victor Emmanuel II in Rome, the Altare della Patria, dominates the Piazza Venezia. The palaces of Turin, the castles of Piedmont, the churches and basilicas where Savoy kings are buried, all of these are part of the fabric of Italian life. The royal palaces of Caserta, Venaria Real, Stupinigi, Racconigi, they are among the finest examples of European architecture, and they draw millions of visitors every year. But the family itself occupies a strange and uncomfortable space in the Italian imagination. They are not romanticized the way the British royal family is. They are not forgotten the way many deposed dynasties have been. They are something in between, a reminder of a chapter in Italian history that many Italians would rather not revisit. The unification of Italy is celebrated, yes, but it is celebrated as the achievement of Garibaldi, of Cavour, of the partisan fighters who liberated Italy from fascism, not as the achievement of the Savoy kings. And the collaboration with Mussolini, the racial laws, the disastrous war, the flight from Rome, these are wounds that have never fully healed. There is still a small monarchist movement in Italy. A political party called Italia Real, or Royal Italy, advocates for the restoration of the monarchy. But its membership is tiny. As of 2012, it had roughly 110 members. It operates on the fringes of Italian politics, more of a nostalgic curiosity than a serious political force. In 2014, for the first time since 1950, no member of the Rockefeller family held a major American political office. And the same phenomenon has played out with the Savoys, only more completely. Their political relevance is essentially zero. What is perhaps most fascinating about the story of the House of Savoy after the fall of the monarchy is how it mirrors broader patterns that we see again and again with deposed royal families across Europe. The Savoys followed a trajectory that is remarkably common. First, exile and bitterness. Then, attempts at restoration that gradually lose momentum. Then, internal feuds over succession and assets. Then, a younger generation that tries to reinvent the family's image through media and business rather than politics. And finally, a slow fade into cultural irrelevance, punctuated by occasional scandals that remind the public the family still exists. The Savoys unified a nation. They gave Italy its identity, its flag, its institutions. They presided over the country's greatest triumphs and its most shameful failures. And then in the span of a single generation, they lost everything. Not to a revolution, not to an invasion, not to a civil war, but to a vote. A democratic referendum decided by a margin of less than 2 million ballots. The House of Savoy was not overthrown, it was simply voted out. And maybe that is the most remarkable part of the entire story. For 1,000 years, the Savoys had survived every crisis that Europe could throw at them. They survived the wars of religion. They survived Napoleon. They survived the collapse of the old order after the First World War. But they could not survive the judgment of their own people. When Italians were finally given the choice, when women voted for the first time, when the question was put plainly, monarchy or republic, the answer was clear. Italy chose to move forward without its kings. The House of Savoy still exists. Its members still carry their titles. They still argue over who is the rightful head of the family. They still dream of jewels locked in a bank vault. But the country they once ruled has long since stopped waiting for them to come back, and that might be the most fitting epitaph for any fallen dynasty. Not that they were overthrown, but that they became irrelevant. So, if you found this story as fascinating as I did, please consider subscribing to this channel. It would mean so much to me, and it helps us keep making content like this. And if you stuck around till the very end, drop a crown emoji in the comments. I'm always grateful for those of you who stay the whole way through. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.